So I've been collecting decoys for a long time. I started off collecting just the typical duck decoys, you know, a redhead, a bluebill, a pintail, that type thing. And everybody's real familiar with, whether you duck hunt or not, you're familiar with a duck decoy. You know, people carved these things back in the day with the intent to use them to attract other decoys, or I'm sorry, other ducks, so they could be pulled, you know, lured within range, shot, killed, and they could be used as food. Some people would sport hunt for them. Some people would belong to fancy gunning clubs, and people, the wealthy people, would come into the Davis Island Club or many of the clubs down East North Carolina, and it would be kind of fancy sport hunting. But when people come to my house and they see these decoys, they're like, yeah, these are cool, I like them. But when they see a shorebird decoy like this, they're like, what's up with this? And you know, when was that made? Was that made 10 years ago? It's like, no, these decoys were carved for the purpose of attracting shorebirds so they can be shot, killed, and used for the table. And they're like, no, there's no meat on those. It's not a dove, it's not a quail, it's not a pheasant. Why would people want to do that? So, you know, in the winter months, you would have all the ducks would come in, and you know, you got all the ducks you wanted. But in the spring of the year, a lot of these migratory shorebirds, it could be a curlew, could be a willet, could be a beach robin, a plover, and we'll see some of those in there. But they would come in big groups, and they would typically come into the kind of the marsh areas, and you know, they would literally shoot these things, sometimes 4 or 5 at a time. And people just, they cannot fathom that people would hunt these. Have you ever heard of this before? I know you have.
Oh yeah.
Have you? Are you from this area?
Born in Kinston, raised in Norfolk. My grandparents though were from the eastern shore of Maryland, and so that was another big hunting, duck hunting.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So haven't been, don't intend to, but I love the birds and I love the stories.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no doubt about it. But they were hunted in such great numbers back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that the population of these shorebirds started to go down. So in 1918, there was a Migratory Waterfowl Act Migratory Bird Act that outlawed market hunting of ducks, outlawed most shorebirds except for 2 species. One, I think, plover, and the other might have been a willet, I think, that you were allowed to continue to hunt. And then in 1928, they shut it down completely. So you could not shorebird hunt. However, so typically, if you see an old shorebird decoy, you typically think, well, it must have been made prior to 1918 because they outlawed them at that point. Not really true.
Did they outlaw even if you were shooting for fun? Not for food. If you were looking for food, and that was not allowed.
Couldn't do it. Yep. So 1918, they outlawed it because the population was getting killed. 1928, they shut it down permanently. Now, if like these decoys here came off Portsmouth Island, don't know who made them, but these were estimated to be made prior to 1900. When you go to the Outer Banks, could be Hatteras all the way up to Duck and Corolla. A lot of the watermen worked at the life-saving stations. These were federal jobs, and a lot of those decoys there were truly made 1918 or earlier, because if they were caught shorebird hunting, they would lose their job at the life-saving station. Carteret County, on the other hand, that was not really the case. You find a lot of shorebirds that were made 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And I would dare say that there were probably some shorebirds. What do you think, Casey? When was the last shorebird shot in Carteret County?
Last season.
Last season?
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
They were hunting, I'm sure, probably up into the early 80s without
That's right.
without having to lay under a piece of
Yep, I agree.
I mean, I'm up to the, I mean, there's silhouette decoys that are, I'm sure were made in the early 80s, Beach Robins and whatever. And when I was growing up, my grandmother, that would have been her best prize if I bought her a load of Beach Robins to cook. She loved to cook them more than anything. And I'm pretty sure she had gotten a mess from somebody, and I was born in 83.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was still, I won't say it's prevalent, but it was still being done up through the 80s.
Yep. But you'll see some decoys in that room that were carved in the 1940s, 1950s. There's some birds. There's a curlew in there made by Julian Hamilton Sr. It's made out of balsa. And the balsa was salvaged from life rafts that were from sunken Liberty ships during World War II. So, and that's another thing people don't realize, that there was actually a war fought right off our waters in World War II. And people don't know that.
I interrupt.
Yeah.
I grew up in Norfolk, right on the beach during the war. I'm that old. And as a kid, I'd go down and walk the beach, and there'd just be huge globs of tar.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my dad one time who worked at the naval base, and I said, "Where's all this tar coming from?" He said, "Oh, ships are just getting rid of their fuel." And I found out much later that they were getting rid of everything. The ships were gotten rid of.
Right. Oh yeah, no doubt. Now, who is this guy?
I just got lost.
They couldn't get way up.
Exactly.
Somebody from Pine Top.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Across the street, I think you get lost.
Yeah, I was thinking something.
Robbie
Yeah.
brought hot dog with him.
Exactly. I could eat one now. But yeah, so that's another thing people don't realize. And these carvers, they didn't go to Lowe's and Home Depot to get wood. If a bunch of balsa washed up on the beach, hey, that's free material to make decoys. So that Julian Hamilton bird in there is made from balsa from a salvaged life raft. Alvin Harris, I have one at my house that was made from balsa. And that's, to me, it's cool. And it was the history and the heritage and that type thing.
You use what you have.
You use what you have. Yeah. And, these two curlews are about the same thickness. So this could have been old ship material from a shipwreck. It could have been old lumber, from Portsmouth when they're building maybe a life-saving station or a church or a house or something along those lines. The bills are made out of nails. They just, whatever they had. But a lot of the North Carolina birds you find have iron bills. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And they're typically nailed through the back of the head. Virginia birds, sometimes the nail bill is done into the head. And a lot of Virginia decoys also had wooden bills that were splined through the back. So if you see a shorebird that has an iron bill or a wire bill, my mind typically takes me to North Carolina. But, I think when we talk about these, it's important to talk about the heritage, the history, and the why. Why did they make these? They made them strictly for the intent to lure in shorebirds so they could be shot. Finding shorebird decoys are rare, and the reason being, if ducks are coming in, you have duck decoys down in the water, and the ducks tend to fly in, so you're typically shooting up, and you're not wounding or destroying a lot of these, the decoys on the water. If you shoot a duck decoy, it's typically because you're trying to kill a cripple and put him out. These, however, you would have a guy on the beach, maybe in the marsh. He might have like a little stake blind to hide, and you're literally shooting into the decoys. So one of the things that I'll do, especially when decoys become kind of expensive, is you want to x-ray them. Make sure that heads have not been replaced. The paint has lead-based paint, which glows under an x-ray. But you will see tons of shot in the x-ray. It is awesome. I mean, you could literally create a topic on the art of the x-ray of a decoy. So the fact that There's not many of these around of the old ones. Make them
Yeah.
worth some money, and people buy them for investment. People buy them for the art. We find people that collect, whether it's regular duck decoys or shorebirds. A lot of times they collect them because maybe they're a bird watcher. They're not a hunter. Some hunters collect them because it reminds them of why they go hunting in the first place. And then you find folk art collectors. You know, Oprah Winfrey, she collects decoys. Ted Turner collects decoys. You know, there's a lot of art people that are into this. Now, we also talk about, you know, we talk about the why, but then let's talk about the what, you know, the art of it. You know, these guys, their client, when they made this, their client was a shorebird. It was a curlew, or it was a willet. It was not a museum. It was not a collector. It was not for a hunter. You know, that was her client. These guys, if they knew what these things would sell for today, they would think you've completely lost your mind. And in some cases, we have.
Like that in some cases.
Yeah.
Was being very nice.
Yeah.
Not wrong.
I heard a comment one time where it's like, man, you've got all these decoys, you must be wealthy. It's like, no, I'm just irresponsible. You know.
No, this is why I'm not.
Exactly. Yeah. But
I'm just gonna take that one home with me.
that
Just fascinates me.
it's incredible. Yeah, it's great. And if you come and, you know, you look at the form, but when you get up close and you look at that dry paint and maybe the cracks or the weatherness, it's just awesome. You know, and you can't, really good paint, it's hard to, really good dry, old, lead-based paint, it's hard to replicate it. And when we go in there, you know, look at the form, but then look at how it was constructed. You know, why did they do this? Why did they do that? You know, why did they use a nail? Because that's what they had. You know, whoever made this probably worked at the life-saving station on Portsmouth Island. And what did they have access to? I mean, that wood is, I don't know, 1.5 inches thick. That's probably building material for building some of the, so he's like, man, I can get some of that material. I can rough out the shape of a curlew. That's an iron rod. Still is corroded from, you know, being in the solid elements. And when they built those homes, they needed these big old nails, a lot of them handmade nails. You know, they didn't go to Lowe's. So they put that in, curved it, shaped out that head, it's one piece. And if you look, I'm gonna kind of walk this around to everybody.
I'm not gonna touch.
Do you see all these holes in
I
there?
do, that's shot.
That's shot.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, if you x-ray this thing, there's gonna be, I bet there's 30 pellets. You think, I think it's probably number 4.
I don't know.
I think fours are tear it apart.
Yeah, it depends on how far you're out.
Yeah, that old 8 lead was a lot different than what we got now.
Bobby, you gonna dwell on some of the prices for let these ladies be fascinated what that little bird is worth?
So there's a funny story. So these are mine. There's a funny story how I got these. So these 2 birds here are pictured in a book. In a book, it's North Carolina Shorebird Decoys by Craigie Andresen and Philip Harvey, both wonderful guys who are mentors to me. So I've always been a fan of curlews and beach robins. So I've wanted these 2 decoys for a long, long time. The guy who was selling them wanted $20,000 for the pair. And I can't afford that kind of money. I'm just like, how am I going to do this? So I had a good friend who lived up in Kitty Hawk. He knew I wanted them. He was pretty well to do, but there were some decoys that I wanted, that he wanted that I owned. So he went into the guy's house and he said, "Where are those birds that Robbie Smith wants but can't afford?" And he said, "There they are." So he bought them. And then he teased me for about a few months. "Look what I've got, look what I've got. But you know what I want." So we ended up working a trade deal. And I got these 2 decoys. And then at the Core Sound Decoy Festival Waterfowl Weekend of this past year, I found this decoy that a collector had. And I was able to get it for a bargain. But they were made by the same guy. Same construction, same nail, same iron rod. So I decided to mount them on that piece of driftwood, bring them back. They were probably hunted together in the 1880s. And now they're back together again. So I've satisfied my need for heritage and history. I grew up fishing with my dad on Portsmouth Island 30, 40 years ago. So that became my place. I was able to satisfy my need for regionality because I have a bit of my soul is there. And then I was able to satisfy my need of the art of the decoy. So I get heritage, history, personal connection, and art. And the good thing about decoys is they don't eat, they don't break down, they don't require gas, you don't have to take them to the doctor. And good. Well, see, if a dog were to start chewing on these, it would have to go to the decoy doctor, which happens. Puppies and cats can be not good.
They're going to the vet and get them x-rays.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you what's funny. First time I went to the vet to x-ray a decoy, they thought I was some Looney Tune person. They're like, "This guy's out here. He's trying to want to x-ray a wooden duck." Yep. Now, one thing I do want to bring up. So we talked about that people carved all these decoys so that they could attract shorebirds, so they can be shot, killed, and eaten. There is a case where some of these birds were not used for food. So you would find egrets and herring. The blue herring, we see those that are stunning. That's still one of my favorite birds of all time. But back in the early 1900s up in New York, you had the millinery trade, where if you remember seeing the women with the hats and the big feathers, fancy feathers, walking through the city, so a lot of decoys were utilized for that. There's a decoy in that room there, and it has been believed or to possibly been used for the millinery trade. But those are typically going to be egrets and herring, and those are the most rare of the birds. But you would find the different species would be red knot. They would also call them beach robins. They would have a little bit of red on the breast, and we'll see some in there. I've been told, Casey, what are your thoughts on this? I've heard that the curlew tastes kind of like steak, filet mignon. The beach robin was probably number 2 favorite.
Yeah. And Stacy beach robin was the favorite only because curlew were just not as harder to come by.
Yeah. And I heard what they would do
That's
is,
what they told me.
yeah. So you have all these little birds. It's not like they would. Yeah. It was. So there's not a lot of meat on these birds, as you can imagine. Well, what I've heard is that they would take as much meat out as they could, and they would stew them with some dumplings. So it would be kind of like our version of what we call chicken and dumplings, but it would be shorebirds and dumplings. Yeah.
When they were hunting, how big a spread did they put out typically when they were hunting? Did they put out 5 or 6 or 20 dozen?
Yeah, so I've seen some old pictures and that type thing. So typically, this room here would probably be a good example that they would fill up a room or an area maybe the size of this room or maybe a little less. And I've seen pictures where there's 12 to 20. And sometimes they would put them in a sack. Sometimes you would see decoys. You see a lot of North Carolina decoys where the stake is made out of either copper or tin, not iron. And they put a little loop-de-loo here. So you could run a rope through the loop-de-loo and carry them all out that way. You also see a lot of decoys. I think there's some in there where there's going to be a hole right here. And they run run a string, they put them over their shoulder, they got a shotgun in this hand, and they're going to the marsh.
You gotta remember, the cost of the shell was so much compared to what you're getting out if you had to kill half a dozen or a dozen of them with every shot, then or enough to get enough food to be worthy of your shot.
Mm-hmm. But back then also, if you think about it, especially in these rural areas, Carteret County, Stacy, there was you didn't have Harris Teeter, you didn't have Food Line. These people literally lived off the land, off the water. They took salvaged material, wood from, the marsh, and this is, this is use what some people call it. I've heard terminology of rural sculpture. Sophisticated, country sophisticated. I've heard all these, but but I have become fascinated with utilitarian art. I don't care if it's a piece of pottery. I don't care if it's a decoy. I don't care if it's a quilt. These are people that used what they had and they made things that got things done. I love it. So, any questions?
Well, I want to tell about Judge Lambert Morris.
Okay.
He was a character.
So here's another funny thing. So shorebird hunting was outlawed in 1918, officially in 1928. And then you have a fella named Judge Lambert Morris, who was a great decoy carver, carved with Alvin Harris, Alvin Harris is arguably Carteret County's second best well-known talented carver. But, you've got a Judge shorebird hunting. You've got a couple of Judge Lambert Morris speech robins. They're great. But he was from they have shot in him. Yeah, he's from Atlantic.
Atlantic address in a Beaufort place here too.
Yep. He from Atlantic, served here, went to this unfortunate school that was. That's true. It's not. Yeah, it's now called Duke, which I'm a Chapel Hill boy.
But everybody think they're
Oh no, we got a wolf pack back here. Here's got a wolf pack guy here, so this is, yeah. But, I tell you, Alvin Harris, and you'll see one in here. Alvin Harris was the bridge between the old school and the new school, the contemporary. He was the guy that literally passed the baton. He was born in 1904 on Portsmouth Island. The first documented decoy he made was in 1912. He was 8 years old. He made these on Portsmouth Island, and they were great, highly sought after. So kids now, they're playing video games, they're tweeting or whatever these kids do now. Alvin Harris was living on Portsmouth, 8 years old, making a decoy. His father was Homer Harris. His uncle was Henry Harris. These guys, they learned the hard way. Alvin Harris ultimately moved to Atlantic, married a woman from Stacy.
He's from Stacy.
Okay, yep.
We still claim him.
Okay, you still claim him?
He moved away when he was young.
Okay. And
I used to play in the harbor behind his old house. This is where he grew up.
okay, yeah. So you'll see so he made there's a beach robin in there. I think that's the only decoy in there that he made. But he made some phenomenal decoys. He was a perfectionist in everything he did. And then probably 1950s, well, probably he met up with a buddy named Homer Fulcher, and they started serving at Menhaden camps together. When in Southport, I know Alvin made a pintail in 1950, gave it to some cooks at a Menhaden camp in Southport. But then you see him later on in life, he learned how to paint. Because everybody in North Carolina, the paint's very basic. I mean, it's just is as plain as they get. You know, if you collect a North Carolina decoy, you do it because of the sculpture, typically not because of the paint. But Alvin Harris learned how to paint from a guy named Dr. Edgar Burke, who was a famous New Jersey artist who used to love to come here to hunt. He'd go to Ocracoke, he'd come to Carteret County, and he taught Alvin how to paint. And some of the curlews from Alvin Harris are stunning, stunning. And Pam, I think you told me one time that after Alvin Harris died, you went to his house and you saw a lot of Audubon magazines.
Yes.
And those,
He used them as reference material.
yeah,
There's a lot, I mean, you can tell there's paint on them. They were on the bench with his paints when I went to his shop.
yeah. And they look just like, they're phenomenal. If you get a chance, go to the Coruscant Museum in Harker's Island and you'll see some of the finest Alvin Harris shorebirds in existence.
Well, his sculptures, they're all one piece of wood. Even the one with the fish coming up.
Yep.
He did one piece of wood, but he always did the feet. But the feet are all for two of them, and I own both of those natural ones. But
Well, I need to come to your house. I'll be there tomorrow morning.
the feet are on them. He called the feet with the same piece of wood. He called the top of it wood. He used one piece of wood. We have two dolphins out there. They're gorgeous at the museum. But you look at it, you don't understand what it is because nothing there to explain it to you.
Yeah.
That's a good, but you have to learn this one piece. And
Right.
See it with the toenails and the toes. That's one piece of wood. This man was fabulous.
Yeah, but he and Alvin Harris and Homer Fulcher taught decoy making at the community college here in Carteret County. So he was from the old school. He made old school decoys, ducks, and shorebirds. And then he became more of a decorative, artistic type carver. And ultimately, if it weren't for him, I mean, somebody argue with me if you disagree. If it weren't for Alvin Harris, would there be a Decoy Carvers Guild? Would there be people in this area still carving decoys?
Not as nice.
Yeah. I mean, his impact, it's immeasurable. But if you get a chance, if you're watching this on video, if you're listening here, go to the Coruscant Museum in Harker's Island. Take your time. Don't just walk by, but look and study all those as the art of the decoy. I mean, his stuff is phenomenal. He used mahogany, juniper, balsa. A lot of the decorative birds were made from balsa. That was, again, salvaged from those Liberty ships in walnut, World War II. Yeah. But I know there's always been kind of a discussion, I won't say an argument, but a discussion on, Mitchell Fulcher is number one as far as the finest decoy maker from Carteret County. I've heard the argument is an Andrew Mason, is an Alvin Harris. And they're two completely different carvers. But both phenomenal.
You said Mr. Harris taught at the college.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what period of time would that have been?
I think in the 1970s, is that right?
He taught at Snug Harbor first.
Where?
At Snug Harbor.
Okay. And when was that?
That would have been the 60s would be my guess, late 60s.
And then he was probably in the 70s here and
Maybe, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Early to mid '70s with him and Homer at the college. I actually got some of the patterns from when he was teaching there. Off of I got a decoy made by a gentleman who took class under him that lived in Stacy, but took class at the college and started carving two-blow decoys.
okay. And then when the decoy
That was some of his patterns from that era, and I believe that was mid '70s.
Yep. And then when the Coruscant Decoy Carvers Guild had their first festival, who was the feature carver? Homer Fulcher.
Mr. Homer.
There you go.
Mr. Homer.
Mr. Homer.
Always be Mr. Homer.
Yeah. So there's that impact. Alvin Harris impacts Homer Fulcher, Mr. Homer. And then the Decoy Carvers Guild is formed with 7 founding members and the first feature carver, Homer Fulcher.
Were those two gentlemen part of the guild?
No,
Before the guild?
they were before the guild.
Homer was. Homer
Hmm.
Mr. Home.
So that's Alvin Harris from the old school passing the baton to the new school. So people like Casey Arthur here, who's one of Carteret County's finest carvers. I mean,
He's our future.
yeah,
He's the future. He's the beginning of the future.
The thing about Homer Fulcher though is he was Mr. Homer Fulcher. He was so much more than just a carver. I mean, he was a Menhaden captain.
yeah.
He was all that, and he was a true gentleman.
Hmm.
He was just such a fine man, and his family and all that. So for those of us who are not decoy focused, but more heritage focused, he was the profile.
Yep, yep.
And,
So
and such a gracious soul.
yeah, so if you're hearing all this, people collect for different reasons. The heritage, because it literally runs in your blood, and the history of things, because some people are just historical nuts. And then there's people in Raleigh, and I was talking with a guy an hour ago, lives in
Billings, Montana.
Billings, Montana. That was 3 hours ago.
Okay.
But having a brain fart. The place in Italy where you
Venice.
Venice, the guy in Venice, Italy. He wants a Robert Pickett Shorebird.
He wants a what?
Robert Pickett Shorebird.
Who don't?
But this is an Italian guy. So these decoys are not. They are trans. It's not just Raleigh people collecting Carteret County birds, or it's not just Beaufort people collecting Carteret County birds. This is an international thing because of the art form. They could care less that Alvin Harris was born on Portsmouth, was influenced by James Audubon. They could care less, but they just love the art form. And I also find that even as primitive as this is, there's a lot of modern art collectors that are now collecting Shorebird decoys. Because you take primitive, you blend it with modern art, and it is awesome. I never would have guessed it, but I agree with that. And I now have a couple pieces of modern art to go with some of my decoys. Ivy Hayes. You want to take a minute and go walk in there and look at some of the stuff here?
Why I mentioned Joe Lambert Morris a while ago.
Yeah.
He was judge, and he was coming, and he was at home in Atlantic, and he was driving here, and the shorebirds were migrating. He would go to the store, and he'd call the courthouse, and delay court would be dismissed that day. Back then they controlled. He went hunting. They went up in the 40s now.
Yeah.
The law went out.
But he's also
The law was behind him.
he's also a judge, breaking the law, shooting shorebirds that were outlawed 30 years ago. Yeah,
That's a benefit of being the
yeah,
judge.
I think the deal there is it's only illegal if you get caught.
Right.
And he also, I got, of course, I own his own license. His son never got married. He lived with a lady, left everything he had to him. I'm a junior, did. And a man was doing some work, and I went by a house to a yard sale, and a young man out there, he said, "We ain't got a thing, Mr. Dupree wants, but every decoy to hop down east." He said, "All he can buy." And the boy said, "I've got a couple of things," and he had a set of branding irons, which he never used, and one of them is longer branding iron, one's a short one, 3 initials. And I had that set. I bought one. I either bought the long license that morning, rolled up. He found them in the attitude part of his pay.
That's cool.
Took it as his pay, is what he did. And he said, "I don't know what to do with it," but I just took it. And he mentioned pottery. The boy was a big pottery player. And then he had the two. He said, "You come back this afternoon and you get the other thing I got." So then I either got the long license that morning or the branding iron that afternoon.
All right, you guys want to kind of come up in here and we'll squeeze in.
Hey,
I
Tom.
was looking for the camera and I realized you're stood on that. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good. Let me get out of the camera quick.
So I'm going to start over in this area here, and we'll kind of spin around this way. So we talked about beach robins. That's typically a southern bird. You typically do not find a lot of beach robins up north. So if you see a beach robin, it's typically going to be Virginia or North Carolina. But these three on the mantle were made by Julian Hamilton Sr. and Julian Hamilton Jr. Julian Hamilton Sr. was from Stacy, North Carolina. It was probably one of the first decoy historians and collectors, and he was a maker. He was the principal of the school in Stacy. He was good friends with Mitchell Fulcher. So these 3 birds were made by them and hunted there. Then we come over here and you see these little peeps. These were made by Irvin Morris, and they're matter of fact, even that one there was made by Irvin Morris too. There is a simple elegance to his birds. They're known as clothespin snipes because they look like a clothespin. But they all have the iron bill. But can you imagine those staked out in the sand? I mean, they look like they're alive right now, you know. But these are highly collectible, highly desired decoys. Hey. And then we come over here, and you're going to see, I'm going to just kind of squat down so you guys can see this, if that's all right. So you're going to see major contrast here in styles. These birds here were made on Harker's Island on the left-hand side. The bodies are made out of cork. The cork could have been salvaged from other cork decoys coming in from Long Island, or maybe it was some material that was used at one of the life-saving stations. But the head is nothing more than a twig. Yeah. Mounted, very primitive, but very effective. I mean, if you're a curlew or if you're another type of bird and you see a bunch of these set out, they look like they're alive. If you see one put out, it looks like a block with a twig on it. But you put out 20 or 30 and you're like, man, look at that. These 3 decoys here were not made in North Carolina. They were made in Detroit, Michigan by the Mason factory. And I think they were in business from 1896 to 1924. So these were probably made in 1900. But some of the fancy gun clubs from Carteret County, this was from the Davis Island Club, which was owned by wealthy New Yorkers. They ordered these decoys and they were used there. So remember what these look like, okay? Because we're going to talk about the influence of these over there in just a few minutes. So made in Detroit, Michigan, hunted at Davis Island. That decoy up there, it's a root head decoy, literally made from the inverted bend of probably a Yopon holly. Then you got your body, probably made out of juniper, but that's made by Gary Bragg. And he's from Ocracoke, North Carolina.
These have eyes.
Mm-hmm. So the premier grade decoys from Mason Factory, they use taxidermy eyes, typically made, I think, of German glass. Yeah. North Carolina carvers rarely put eyes in them because they felt like if the bird got close enough to shoot, they didn't care if the bird didn't care if it had an eye or not. You see this bird right here? It's probably a small blue heron. And this would be possibly used in the millinery trade, not to eat, but to attract, heron in for to harvest feathers. And then this area. So we talked about Alvin Harris. This is a decoy that Alvin Harris made. He was a perfectionist. The paint's phenomenal. Cross feathering back here in the tail. Everything's rounded out. It's a copper stake. This is made out of juniper, but I'm going to show it. Look real close. What do you see?
Shot.
A lot of shot.
Yeah, number 9.
And to me, when you find a bird that's been shot or crudely repaired to keep it going, I mean, is there anything better than that? Yeah. I don't think so. But that's the art of Alvin Harris. Always phenomenal. Has anybody? Have you ever seen an ugly Alvin Harris decoy? No. Don't. I have.
It was used for a purpose.
Yeah.
Some had this very neat, some more crude than others, but really you can't say they're ugly.
Yeah. This is a.
What would happen when it classifies men?
This is a early Portsmouth Island bird. It's in a running, swimming position. You know, so some of these guys made these decoys to show movement. Maybe they're feeding, like you'll see some decoys back here in a feeding position. This is in a running position. I don't know who made it. I've talked to a few people, and there's a possibility that Frank Gaskell from Portsmouth made it because a lot of his birds, Brant in particular, had swimming type poses. This has that. You know, you talked about how our birds carry to the field. There's a little U-tack there where you could string it up there. There's a hole there which could serve the same purpose. And this decoy, when it came out in the market, it had a very crude bill repair. So this bill is a professional replacement. It was done by a decoy restoration guy. So, you know, a lot of these things are shot up or beat up, and there are people who can professionally repair their, let's call them a duck decoy plastic surgeon.
Does it really make it more valuable to have it professionally?
It will. And it depends on who does it.
Okay.
A guy named Russ Allen did this. He does a great job.
Who was that?
His name is Russ Allen. Had Robbie Smith repaired this, it would have gone down in value. Had Casey Arthur fixed it,
Yeah.
it'd go up in value.
I don't think I'm in the restoration category as Russ.
Curlews are some of my favorite birds. I like the beach robins because of the paint, but curlews, the form, it's just awesome. The long bills, long-billed curlew. This decoy here is made by Robert Pickett, one of my favorite carvers. They're the three oldest decoy makers from Carteret County: Mitchell Fulcher, Emmy Paul, Robert Pickett. That's a Robert Pickett there. Remember I told you there was a guy in Italy that wants a Robert Pickett? That's what he wants. But you know what? He ain't gonna get it. Are you gonna sell yours? You gonna send it to Italy? No, mine's not going to Italy. This bird here is made by John Lupton. John Lupton is from the sea level area. I mean, it's just awesome. It's thick, it's crude, but it's just, it is awesome. Remember when I wanted you guys to remember what that bird looked like? The Mason Factory Curlew. This guy here, Julian Hamilton Sr., made this in the manner of that. Same form, same paint color. It's a little smaller, but a lot of these carvers carved decoys in the manner of decoys that they were influenced by. Maybe it was a Jim Holly from Maryland, maybe it was a Joe King from New Jersey, or the Mason Factory from Detroit, because a lot of these factory birds came here to the high-end gun clubs. But you know, you put a grouping of these together, I don't care if they're made by the same guy or a different guy, they're just awesome because they come to life. Now, some of the most folksy decoys from Carteret County, they almost look like they're aliens, were made by a guy named Lech Lewis. He was originally from Stacy, North Carolina. I think moved to Kinston later on. Casey, why don't you talk a little bit about Lech Lewis here? Because you want to come up here and talk?
Yeah, I don't know a ton about him. To be honest with you, I know obviously his family after him.
He's good friends with Mitchell Fulcher. They did some stuff together.
Yep. As most people who had anything to do with sporting at the time were, decoys and duck hunting. It was a small group. Stacy had a bigger population then, but it was still a small group. And Lechler, the best story I know about Lechler has to do with a man named John Henderson. And John Henderson was young, had a baby in a stroller in Kinston, and was walking his baby down the, I guess it was a sidewalk, and he saw a skiff full of decoys, and he was looking for something to do, been in a house with a baby, getting ready to go back to work, and he said, well, I think I want to be a little more outdoors, that kind of thing, and so this guy must know something about it. So I went knocked on the door and said, hey, I'm trying to buy some decoys. I saw those in that skiff out in the front yard, just kind of almost like what you plant flowers in, you just kind of put it out there, but it had decoys in it. And he said, well, I'll get you some decoys, but that there is a load of junk, you know, that's all rotted and whatever, it's just been laying in there. He said, but I'll take you somewhere to get you some decoys. And he said, if you pick me up here Saturday morning, we'll drive down there. And this was in Kinston. Turns out it was Leckler Lewis in Kinston, as he ran the seafood business there in Kinston. And John got Leckler into the car, and Leck and him rode from Kinston to Stacy, my hometown, and turned into the general store that my wife's grandfather and great-grandfather ran, Ralph Nelson and Sons General Store, and that's where he bought his first decoys, John Henderson. But Leck Lewis took him there. But yeah, he was big into the seafood business. I think he started out as a oysterman and ran the seafood business, and partially ran a business in Stacy with Elmer Solder, who's also a very good decoy carver.
So you're just now hearing about the heritage of the decoy. Now let's look at the art of these things. That's probably a running yellow legs. That is a yellow legs by Leck Lewis.
That bill is all cut off. He pointed his bills instead of pieces.
So you look at the different artists' interpretation of what that species was. You see these root head, funky, folksy, alien-looking curlews. That's the exact same species as these three here. So if you're a curlew flying in, would you rather fly into these or those, or would you care?
Well, if you're a bird flying overhead, I don't know that you could tell that much difference, could you?
But they were all effective.
Yeah.
Now the question is, which decoys are going to attract the collector, the investor, the buyer, the hysteria story? No, I don't. Yeah.
He did a lot of stuff, from what I understand. He did a lot of things like that when he went to Kinston. Just to pass the time and remember home and all that stuff.
Yeah, he made a lot of miniatures at that time.
His grandson's got a house full of ducks. I mean, I was only familiar with his shorebirds, but he's got a house full of regular duck decoys.
I mean, well, his canvas was kind of crude. I wish that chain on that canvas one he made for canvas. But here again, he didn't make it decorative. He made it to eat with. They put them out there, but they're collectible. And the story behind them makes them more collectible, more desirable.
Oh yeah, no question.
This is it, and it's always the story.
Yeah.
If you don't have a story, it ain't nothing any good.
Yeah, but next time you go to the beach, next time you go to the marsh, and you're sitting out there on the beach, and you're maybe sipping on a cold beverage, and you see some peeps walking, or you see some birds flying in, take a look at what they are. Yeah, could they be curlew? Could they be beach robins? Could they be this? Envision how the hunters would put out the decoys. Envision how they would be shot and the whole 9 yards. It is fascinating to me. Anybody have any questions? Comments or?
Hey Robbie, I got a question.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot more unknown shorebirds than there is regular decoys. Why do you think that is? You just think because they all look more similar, or because anybody was making them because they could just walk to the beach and hunt?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So a lot of shorebirds hunting took place between 1880 and say 1920, when there were a lot of undocumented carvers. A lot of these guys were known primarily because of their duck decoys, and because they made typically more of those. They typically made a lot of duck decoys, sometimes commercially, to be sold to hunters and collectors or gun clubs and that type thing. And some decoy makers would make thousands in their lifetime Eldon Willis, Elmer Salter probably made 5,000, 8,000 decoys. But you typically did not make shorebird decoys commercially. You typically made it for your own use. And a lot of these people just didn't know who they were made.
They write
Who
their
they
names
were.
on the wall along the roof of the Bible.
Yeah, some of them, but you know, if
Some
it,
of that little branding iron that Nathan's people up there in Virginia.
yeah. But you know, the Portsmouth birds in there, you know, they were made certainly before 1900, and you know, they're probably made by some officer at the life-saving station who probably made one rig, and that's all they ever made. And there weren't people documenting it back there. Probably the first person documenting decoy makers was probably Julian Hamilton Sr. would be my guess. So it's easier to identify shorebirds from 1920 on. It's very difficult to.
Most of the Guthrie and Styron birds from Harker's Island, those families aren't really known for making any full decoys that I'm aware of. But whereas most of these folks, you know, we know the decoys and they made the shorebirds, but like
Yeah.
those families, if they had any, I'm not aware
So
of.
I have seen. So I went to a boathouse on Harker's Island that had Guthrie family birds in them. A lot of them were relics. The birds that I typically found in that shed were Mason factory birds and some Robert Pickett bodies that had the heads missing. And that was a Guthrie family boathouse from 1900. That was one of the most fun days I've ever had in my life. Yeah. Anybody else?
We just came from the museum and
Oh, did you? Nice.
the proprietor over there, the fellow at the front door, suggested we come here.
I'm glad you came.
Yes, very interesting. Nice.
But in a nutshell, I think you understand why I love this stuff. Because it satisfies heritage, history, art, and I love anything utilitarian art from North Carolina. And a decoy, man, gets my heart go pitter patter.
I have been schooled.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah,
Why don't we give Robbie a round of applause?
I've called you guys. Thank y'all. I appreciate it.